Thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you very much, the YIRRAMBOI Festival, for having us here. It's lovely to be here with Dr. Foley, and we're going to start the slideshow. So we've got about an hour to slot it all in, and really hope that you enjoyed this. It's been a learning experience for me, so hopefully everyone will get something from it. 1965. How old were you then?
I was 15 years old, and I was living in God's own country. Sorry to any of no offence to any of the traditional owners down this way or any of my brothers and sisters from other parts of Australia, but extensive research by myself as a prominent Indigenous historian has shown that for 80,000 years, the best looking and the smartest bunch of people out of the 500 different nations were the Gumbainggir people, which remarkably were my people. So in 1965, I was living in my homeland in Gumbainggir land on the north coast of New South Wales. And this is the first picture that I wanted to bring up today.
Yeah, so tell us about your experience when you attended high school, Dr. Foley.
Well, this picture, as I say to my students all the time, tells you the reason why I've spent 47 or something consecutive winters in Melbourne, away from my subtropical homeland. This picture tells you several stories about the state of Australia, the nature of Australia in the 1960s when I was growing up. For a start, as you can see, there's only one little black fella in this class, in amongst all those apprentice rednecks. I'm being a little bit unfair, folks. Not all of them kids grew up to be rednecks. Only about 85% of them. But like I said, this photograph tells you several things about what Australia was like in this era that I was growing up there. For a start, the Gumbainggir people, unlike down this way, which is the killing fields of Australia, where a significant part of the populations of the different nations down this way got wiped out in massacres in the early parts of the invasion and occupation of their homelands. Up home, my people survived the initial invasion and occupation in much better shape, to the extent where by the 1960s the Gumbainggir people were still around about 20-25% of the local population in the Nambucca Valley. And this high school served the three major towns in the Nambucca Valley. Two of those towns had Aboriginal reserves on the edge of them, Barraville and Nambucca Heads. And despite the fact that we were 20% of the population, there were only 3 Aboriginal kids in that local high school, and there's one of them there. What that says to you historically about what was going on in Australia at the time, that is evidence of the extent to which Aboriginal people were deliberately and systematically denied educational opportunities. Another thing that this photograph tells you about what was going on in them days is this was the era of segregation, and what that meant for someone like me was that I could sit next to any of these kids in class during the week, but on the weekends, the only entertainment in 1965 for young 15-year-olds like we were there, in rural areas like Nambucca Heads, the only entertainment was the local picture theatre. I know this is extraordinary for some of the younger people in the audience to realise and understand, but there was no internet then. In fact, there wasn't even television up there then. And so the only entertainment we had was the local picture theatre Saturday night. I couldn't sit next to any of these kids in this picture on a Saturday night. Why? Because the local picture theatre was segregated. And what that meant was a roped-off section down the front of the picture theatre where the blacks sat in front, and all the white kids got to sit up the back in the good seats. Another thing about that this photograph tells you about Australia in 1965, have a good look at this photograph. How many non-Anglos are in this photograph? There's only one. This, folks, is the era of the White Australia policy. And there is evidence of the extent to which still, more than halfway through the 20th century, the White Australia policy reigned supreme. So there you go, folks. That was my experience in growing up in Maxwell High School. And not long after this photograph was taken, at the end of sixth form, at the end of fifth form, I had my secondary education abruptly terminated when the headmaster of that local high school called me in and he expelled me with these words. He said, "Foley, don't come back next year." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because," and these are the words he used, he said, "because we don't want your kind here." And with that, he not only expelled me, I was actually going really good in this class. None of them rednecks there were all that smart, whereas I was. And I was the first Aboriginal kid to ever go past fourth form in Maxwell High School. And yet I still was told to get out and have my secondary education abruptly terminated because that was the nature of that little racist enclave on the North Coast that I grew up in. And I'll talk more about what the end result of that was later in this talk. But what that headmaster did to me by expelling me was not only terminate my secondary education, he demolished my self-confidence, my self-esteem, and worst of all, he demolished and destroyed at that time my belief in education, which I think is the worst thing that anyone ever did it to me in my entire life, and that's really saying something. So that was the wonders of Maxwell High School, folks.
Yeah. So...
Oh, am I supposed to...
No, we're going to play a video now. So this is the time we were talking about the theatre days and the television days, mixing in with his activism as well.
This is a little clip to entertain you from the first ever all Aboriginal television show, a political satire that was long before its time. It was very unpalatable for white Australia, but to this day, blackfellas still love it. What's it say? I haven't got my glasses on.
You may be a victim of software counterfeiting.
Oh, my God.
It's been hacked.
You know what? In the long run, I reckon we'd be better off with a more restrictive immigration policy.
So that's not me now. So that's a really strong message, and it's still quite relevant today with the current political climate. Why was it important to bring those strong historical and political statements into theatre and television, Dr. Foley?
Because of this man, whose daughter is sitting straight in front of me, so I've got to say nice things about him. Bob Mazza was the founder of the National Black Theatre Company back in the early 70s in Sydney. Bob Mazza was also the man who was at the centre of the incident that occurred in 1969 at the Aboriginal Advancement League out at Northcote, just near where Westcar Station is these days, which saw the term Black Power enter the Australian political language. But in 1970, Bob, along with 5 other Aboriginal people, visited a Black Power conference in Atlanta, Georgia, in America. And on his way back to Australia, he called into New York and went and visited the National Black Theatre in Harlem. And he was so inspired by what he saw there that when he got back to Australia, he said that he thought that it was really important that the newly emerging Black Power movement, self-determination movement, land rights movement, call it whatever you like, but he thought that it was really important that that movement that was really gaining strength in the late 1960s really should have some sort of a cultural wing. And so he set up an organisation in Sydney in Redfern, and Redfern was a place in 1969 through to 72. Because of the closing down of the old apartheid system in New South Wales, there'd been a mass exodus from the rural areas in New South Wales to the extent where the Aboriginal population of Redfern, when I moved there, when I got kicked out of school, I moved to Sydney. When I moved to Redfern in end of 1966, there were around about 1,500 Aboriginal people there. By 1969, there were 35,000 Aboriginal people in Redfern. That's the biggest Aboriginal community that has ever existed in the entire history 80,000-year history of Australia. And so it was a dynamic, interesting and great place to be. And Bob Mazza set up the National Black Theatre in Redfern at a time when independent, community-controlled Aboriginal legal service, Aboriginal health services, Aboriginal children's breakfast programs were being set up by the Black Power movement on the basis of ideas that we were plucking from different parts of the world, including the Black Panther Party in America. And so Bob set up the National Black Theatre, and he conned me into joining one day when he said, come down to the Nimrod Theatre in the Cross. We're rehearsing a review. I went down and I was sitting down there one day and I was sitting up in the bleachers watching them rehearse, and I must have said something because Bob looked up in the bleachers and he said, what's the matter with you? And I said, I reckon I could do that better than you, being a smart ass that I was. And he said, OK, smart ass, come down and do it. And that was the way in which he conned me into becoming part of the cast and crew. I then wrote a few new sketches for the show, but that show was the first really successful all-Aboriginal theatre production in Australia. The only one that had gone on before that, I think, was down here in Melbourne with Bill Onus and them in the early 1950s having a production. But basically Blak was an intensely political, satirical review, and it played to packed houses at the Nimrod Theatre. And one of the interesting aspects, this is about the stage production of Basically Blak, was this. This is the poster for the stage show of Basically Blak. Now, folks, this poster was made by Brett Whiteley, who some of you may have heard of. And as a result of this being made by Brett Whiteley, years later, and I mean, I was one of the people who got Brett Whiteley to do this for us. I knew Brett Whiteley at the time when he was just an up-and-comer like all of us, because I knew him through Martin Sharp, another up-and-coming artist at the time. But years later, I realised that, gee, the original of this poster must be worth a few quid nowadays. And so the director of the show and the owners of the Nimrod Theatre were these two people, Lillian and Ken Horler. And years later, about 15 years after the show in 1972, I approached Ken Horler. I bumped into Ken Horler in Woolloomooloo in Sydney. And I said to him, hey, whatever happened to the original of that poster we got Whiteley to do? And Horler said, it's on my living room wall. I said, mate, he didn't do that for you. He made that for us, the members of the Black Theatre. I said, you bastard, give that back to us. And Horler looked at me down his nose and he said, try and take it. Which was a scary thing for him to say to me, because he at the time was one of us, by that time, was one of Sydney's top legal eagles, one of his top lawyers. So I had no chance of getting off him. And so I didn't talk to Horler again for another 20 years or so, and this photograph was taken a year ago when I did start talking to him again, when I'd softened my attitude when I realised that he wasn't well. And really sadly, I got a message last night from Rachel Mazza, who's sitting in the front row, that Ken in fact died yesterday. And I was intending to come here and shit-can him tonight, but I feel really bad now because Ken was the director of Basically Blak, the stage version, and Ken and Lillian were the founders of the original Nimrod Theatre in Sydney, which later evolved into Belvoir. So it's, these two are really significant characters in the cultural history of Sydney. The only other thing I'll say about Basically Blak, the ABC decided to make a television pilot for a series based on the stage production. When they saw the script we wrote, they got cold feet, and only one show was ever made. And it still stands up really good today. In fact, I reckon, but I'm biased, I reckon it stands up really good against this new black comedy mob these days. But we won't go into that now.
Well, it was a time where we didn't see many Aboriginal actors on the big screen, Dr. Foley. So how hard did you have to really push to make it into TV and into acting in theatre and television?
I think the people who had a tougher time than me, or the real pioneers, of Aboriginal people involved in television in particular were Bob Mazza and Bindi Williams and Justine Saunders. And they had a tough time of it in the very early days. And Bob, in fact, I think Bob was the first Aboriginal person to play a role in an Australian soapie. I think he played a doctor in Bellbird. Years later, I played as revenge against all of the lunatic fringe fundamentalist Christians who were driving me mad at the time, I played an Aboriginal pastor in country practice in the early 1980s. But that's another story. Like I said, the real pioneers were Bindi, Bob, Justine Saunders, and a few others. And I particularly also pay tribute in terms of theatre to Brian Siren, who was a great inspiration to me. Brian studied in New York in Stella Adler's acting studio. He was a classmate of Robert De Niro, for crying out loud. Stella Adler empowered him to come back to Australia and set up an Australian branch of her acting studio. And Noel Tovey, who I believe has spoken here before, another great, his story is a truly extraordinary one too, in much more difficult earlier days than those that I was around.
So there would have been some interesting times coming into the acting sphere with the different personalities and parties and whatnot.
I was in a film I got into movies. Well, I'm not going to go. I haven't got time to tell the story about my movie career, short as it was and as unglamorous as it was. But then I never ever pretended I was an actor. I had a bit of fun through the years, being involved in various theatre and stage and television stuff. But I was never one of the proper actors like Bindi or Bob or Justine or any of them crew.
Well, it sounds like a very interesting time. We might move into the next lot of slides where things even become a bit more serious. So you're going to play the first one. This jersey is definitely a statement. Do you want to tell us more about that, please, Dr. Foley?
1971 was the last time that the ambassadors of apartheid, the South African rugby team, the Springboks, toured Australia. And we had challenged, the Australian anti-apartheid movement was gearing up for big demonstrations in the upcoming tour. And this was during a period when we were having major Aboriginal land rights demonstrations throughout Australia, in southeastern Australia. And Paul Coe jumped up, Paul Coe, the leader of the Aboriginal Black Power movement, Black Collective in Sydney, challenged the anti-apartheid activists one day and said, how is it you mob are turning out in these numbers demonstrating against apartheid halfway around the world? What about here in Australia where, what about in your own backyard where you might be considered to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution, which is what you see yourselves as now? The anti-apartheid people responded really positively to that, and instead of telling Coe to go and get stuffed, they took up the challenge and started attending our land rights marches, which dramatically increased the numbers who were turning out in land rights marches in 1971. But that led to us then to join them in the up-and-coming anti-apartheid demonstrations. And Jim Boyce, who was a rugby player, Australian rugby player, who'd played in South Africa and saw what apartheid was really all about and came back really angry, had acquired 3 genuine South African rugby football Guernseys. And he rang us up one day at our little Black Power commune in Bondi and said, listen, when I was in South Africa, the South African Prime Minister said that no black man would ever wear this particular football Guernsey, And so Jim Boyce said, if you guys wear these jackets at the demos, these jerseys at the demos, the South African players are going to really freak out. And so he lent us these 3 jerseys, and there's one of them there. And we wore them at the demos, which created a bit of a sensation, especially back in South Africa, which was great fun. And there's a And so we joined and became very prominent in those anti-apartheid activities in Sydney and Canberra during 1971. And it was out of these demonstrations that came this particular image, which is one of the more notorious surviving images of me. And this came about one very cold and wet morning. You don't really see it in this version of the picture, but you do see it in this version of the picture, where one morning very early there was just me and these three little old ladies out there in front of the Squire Inn in Bondi Junction, where the Springbok football team were staying.
So, I mean, for me, this vigil in the rain is an image of sadness, but also resilience. How are you feeling after that day?
Quite cold, actually. But the interesting thing about when the Springboks came to Australia, there was a great deal of secrecy, that the Australian government tried to keep it really secret where they were going, because the trade union movement came out strongly and put bans on aeroplanes carrying them. Hotels that where they were stayed were being refused service at, all sorts of stuff. The trade union movement took a really strong stance, so the government felt compelled to keep it really secret where they were staying. And when they turned up in Sydney, by that time the Black Power Collective in Redfern had moved from Redfern because of the police harassment, and we'd set up in a little, a big old house in Bondi Junction. And next door to the house in Bondi Junction that was our Black Power Collective commune, there was a car park. And straight across the car park was the Squire Inn. And lo and behold, this is where the government stuck the Springbok football players. So, that's how come I'm sitting there early in the morning. It was just outside our back door. So, there was a big faux pas on the part of the Australian government and made us... And we opened up our commune for all the anti-apartheid demonstrators then. But as has been said in a documentary made by a Canadian woman filmmaker, that was the last time that the Springboks ever toured Australia before the end of apartheid. Oh, and one little incident, I think this happened in Melbourne. At the time of the Springbok tour, the anti-apartheid movement pulled off a stunt in Melbourne with this black Zimbabwean student from Monash, a student called Simba Mumbagegwe, who these days, or until very recently, was Robert Mugabe's foreign minister. And I'm sure that he'd be most embarrassed in his later stages of his career with Robert Mugabe to see himself in this picture. He was painted white as part of one of the many stunts that were pulled off by the anti-apartheid movement at the time. Simba was, in fact, a really good friend of ours, and Jean will remember him. And he was going to Monash at the time, and that's how come we both in the Aboriginal movement and in the anti-apartheid movement, the intensely political scene that was happening at Monash at the time, we all got to know him really well. But that's Simba, Robert Mugabe's foreign minister, folks.
Very right. Okay, so we'll move into the next slide with the headline that I want to read to everyone. Oh, we've got those images. Did you want to show the first one again, just so everyone?
Images. The first one is just a photograph.
Photograph
from the article.
Yep. We only have a small supply of explosives at present and thought we'd save it for something important. So what was the story behind this article and its headline?
Now, folks, I put it to you that if I said that today, I'd be in an orange jumpsuit in chains rendered by the CIA to Guantanamo Bay. And so I feel that it's important I explain myself. This is a now defunct newspaper called the Sunday Australia. It's a Rupert Murdoch paper, one of his early papers. It's no longer Australia, no longer a Sunday paper, but like I said, we had our Black Power commune in Bondi Junction in 1971, and I'm sitting there one day and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and this bloke says, "My name's Simon Townsend." I said, "Yeah, I know you." Now, a lot of you younger people here may have grown up with that terrible, horrible children's show, Simon Townsend's Wonderworld, you know, where with Giggly Simon and his dopey, well, with his dog had a lot more personality than him. However, back in the 1960s, Simon Townsend was one of Australia's more courageous anti-draft resistors. You know, in the 1960s they had conscription, which almost got me too, but that's another story. And Simon Townsend was a conscientious objector. He got dragged out of his house, forcibly taken in and into the Australian Army, brutalised in an army stockade, and eventually when the army realised he was genuine conscientious objector, they spat him out and he decided to become a journalist. So that's the context in which I knew Simon Townsend then. So I get a phone call one day in the Black Power commune. "This is Simon Townsend." I said, "I know you are, mate." I said, "What do you want?" He said, I'm writing for the Sunday Australia now. I'd really like to do a story on Black Power." I said, "Yeah, sure, mate. Come over to Bondi, take us down to the pub, share us a few beers, we'll tell you all about it." So he comes over and we go down to the local hotel in Bondi, which I don't think's there anymore, and he starts shouting us jugs of beer on Rupert Murdoch's expense account, you know. And so we had a great old time. We told him all about self-determination, the collective in Redfern, the free shopfront legal services we'd set up, the free shopfront health clinics, the breakfast for kids programs, all this stuff. Great afternoon. And went on for a couple of hours. And eventually Simon Townsend suddenly jumped up and he said, "Okay, I've got to go." And Billy Craigie, the guy there with the fist on his T-shirt, Billy Craigie said, "Whoa, where are you going, Simon?" Simon said, "No, I've got to go back to the office and write up this story." And Billy, quick-thinking Billy Craigie, said, "Oh, no, don't go yet, mate." And Simon said, No, I've got to go." And Billy says, "Oh, don't go yet, mate. We haven't told you about the explosives." And Simon Townsend says, "Explosives?" And Billy said, Yeah, sit down and buy us another round, mate. You know, we'll tell you all about it. And so we spun Simon Townsend's bullshit yarn with me saying this shit here in this headline, and we got another 2 rounds of jugs out of him. And we all went back to the commune and slept off our hangovers. Forgot all about it. Then 3 days later on the Sunday, we got a phone call. "Hey, have you fellas seen the paper?" I said, "No, why? What's in it?" They said, "Oh, we think you'd better have a look." And that's the story of that, folks. But what this article had the effect of doing was this. These are... Suddenly, the Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation became very interested in us for reasons that are probably obvious from the headline. And these are, in fact, photographs from my ASIO file. Surveillance photographs of me and Dennis Walker behaving suspiciously in the vicinity of the Communist Party headquarters in Sydney in Dixon Street.
It's interesting. So how did you know that you had these files on you?
Well, for those of you in the audience, and I can see some who've got an ASIO file, as you will know, and for the younger ones who are in the process of acquiring an ASIO file, which you inevitably will do by being here tonight, all you've got to do is wait 30 years and all government documents, including ASIO files, revert to the National Archives in Canberra. So just wait 30 years and go up to the National Archives, and every 1st of January a new batch of your files come out. Some people like Philip Adams likes to skite all the time on Radio National about his ASIO file, but go and look at his ASIO file. It's about this big, folks, you know. Whereas mine is much bigger than that. But so for the last 10 or 15 years or so, every 1st of January I'd go up to Canberra, National Archives, pluck out the latest instalment of my ASIO files. And so there's some interesting stuff in it, some really boring shit in it as well, but the really salutary lesson though for young people these days, back then ASIO, as Jean knows, because Joan Cox's, one of Jean's mates, got me one day to go with her taking photographs of ASIO people at their little jaunts places around St Kilda Road and other places. Back in those days, ASIO was an incompetent amateur outfit. Pathetic. These days, it's a different kettle of fish, folks. These days, the technology is much more advanced. They don't need to drill a hole in the wall and stick a little microphone and have a big reel-to-reel tape recorder on the other side. And they don't need to take photos here with like this. The technology means that they're much more dangerous. The resources they got post 9/11 are extraordinary. The whole paranoia about terrorism these days means that they are really a dangerous outfit. So whilst I may joke about them now, just beware. And as I say to my students, the lesson for young people these days, if you go out in the morning knowing that Asia is going to take photos of you, don't be like me. Think ahead sartorially. You know, don't just think, am I going to look good today? You've got to think 30 years ahead, you know, so that when you show people your ASIO surveillance photographs, you won't look like a dag like I do there.
So historically, though, in Australia, there was a paranoia about Indigenous resistance links with communism. Was this something you saw during this time?
We were aware that ASIO was around snooping on us, but we really didn't care because despite the headline, we knew that we weren't doing anything that outrageous. I mean, probably the worst thing that we did, even though a lot of Australians back in those days thought we were dangerous radical maniacs, the worst thing we ever did, I think, politically in those days was if we thought we were losing the interest of the media at any point in 1971, all you need to do is go to the local hardware store, buy a can of black paint, go down and chuck it over Captain Cook in Hyde Park, and you get instant headlines, you know, Black Power, you know. It was great, but ASIO didn't particularly worry us in them days. In fact, on my website you'll see photographs that I actually took of ASIO filming us, you know.
So was it important to have that solidarity between black and white people to battle apartheid?
Absolutely, to this day. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, it's not a struggle about race, it's a struggle about justice and equity and a non-neoliberal society, a society that is, you know, a better society for our grandkids to grow up in. I mean, the only thing that I feel sad about these days is that we actually managed at the Aboriginal Embassy in 1972 to actually change the world that we lived in. And it wasn't just us. The big anti-Vietnam moratorium demonstrations, the big mass student movement, the strong union movement at the time, all of these things combined to create a really good situation in Australia. And it was all sailing along perfectly well until the CIA came along and knocked off Whitlam, and that was the end of that.
Mm. Yeah, there was also an important time in 1970 and 1971, around that time, and 72, with your involvement in setting up the New South Wales Aboriginal Legal Service, the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service, and the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. So how hard was it to make it possible and be involved in so many important establishments with the pressure from the police?
It was the police who motivated us to do it. It was police harassment and intimidation in Redfern when I was 17 that was the major motivating factor in the politicising of me. Two things politicised me when I was 17. I got a really good flogging from the notorious 21 Division of the New South Wales Police Force in a place called Regent Street Police Station in Sydney, just off Railway Square. And a week after that, a bloke called Paul Coe approached me, Aboriginal guy, and said, we're thinking about us young people setting up a little group to see if we can counter this police harassment and intimidation that's going on to us. He didn't need to ask me twice. And when I said, yeah, no worries, count me in, he handed me a book. And he said, read this, which was a bit of a surprise for me because since I'd been thrown out of school, I'd never read anything. But the book was called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And those two things, the police bashing and the autobiography of Malcolm X, politicised me overnight. And it was a group of young people in Redfern, 35,000 strong community, everyone impoverished, tough situation that led to us looking at situations around the world. We looked at what was going on in Cuba, we looked at what was going on in China. We looked at what was going on in the radical branch of the African American movement in America. We looked at the Native American movement and what they'd done at Alcatraz in 1969, or whenever it was. And we adopted and adapted all these ideas and eventually developed ideas to the Australian context that enabled us to create. We introduced free legal aid to Australia when we set up the New South Wales Aboriginal Legal Service, using volunteer white lawyers in 1972 to set up a free shopfront legal aid centre. And we also, a few months later, legendary Redfern matriarch Mum Shirley Smith, approached us young punks and said, listen, you young bastards, there's a lot of health problems in this community. Why can't we set up a free shopfront medical clinic on the same basis you set up a legal service? We said, sure, okay, let's have a meeting. And to that meeting came, that first meeting that we had about setting up a medical service, came a mad, pipe-smoking, mountain-climbing, communist eye doctor called Fred Hollows. And it was Fred who became one of the major moving forces, I suppose, behind helping us set up the first free shopfront medical clinic in Australia. We stole another idea from the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, set up a free breakfast for kid program, which later evolved into the Murrawina Aboriginal Women and Children's program. So there's all these communities, what we call community survival programs being set up. We created all of this stuff with no government money, no nothing. And that it was all of this activity that led then directly into the legendary 1972 Aboriginal Embassy, which changed the course of Australian history. The Aboriginal Embassy brought an end to the era of assimilation, but that's another story. But that's the real significance of the 1972 Aboriginal Embassy. Oh, I'm supposed to be moving on.
No, have a drink.
Sorry? Yes. There you go. Am I supposed to be saying this bit?
No. So you've got some two men who you've marked as heroes, and can you tell us about your association with these famous people? So Russell Means is from the American Indian movement. You want to talk about your relationship with him?
There's a couple of people who, for 40 years, were my great political heroes. First and foremost was Russell Means, one of the leaders of the American Indian movement, along with John Trudell and Dennis Banks. But in the American Indian movement had occupied the old Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay in the 1960s. And that was one of the inspirations in the back of our mind when we set up the Aboriginal Embassy in 1972. In 1972, when the then Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, made his notorious Australia Day statement that the government would never grant Aboriginal land rights, a meeting in Redfern considered what we might do in response to that statement by the Prime Minister. And among the things we considered, thinking about what the Indians had done in Alcatraz, we thought about Fort Denison in the middle of Sydney Harbour, Pinchgut Island. And some of us said, well, why don't we row out and take over Fort Denison? And we would have done it, except none of us big, brave, tough, black power boys, none of us were game to row a boat out in the middle of shark-infested Sydney Harbour in the middle of the night. And so that idea went down the drain. But the American Indian movement's actions in doing that were a great inspiration, but Russell Means in particular was one of my greatest heroes for most of my life. And then a few years ago, I heard he was coming out to Australia. And I thought, do I really want to go and meet him? Because often when you want to meet somebody who's been your hero for most of your life, you think to yourself, well, he may not be who I want him to be, who I've always believed him to be. And so I've been reluctant to meet some people who I've always had great admiration for, but Russell Means, I thought, no, I'll go and meet him anyway. Even if he's a complete arsehole, it'll still be great to meet him. But as luck would have it, I went and met him in Adelaide at a conference we had over there, and I had the really intimidating experience of giving a public lecture with him sitting in the front row watching me, you know. But he turned out to be the very man that I always believed him to be, wanted him to be, and thought he was. And this photograph here is of probably one of the greatest moments in my entire life.
And Emery Douglas, who was the Minister for Culture in the Black Panther Party of America in the 1960s. How did you get to meet him?
Well, Emery Douglas is one of the few survivors of the Black Panther Party of America, because most of the leadership got wiped out in shootouts with the LAPD and other police forces around America. But Emery Douglas was the guy who was responsible for a lot of the famous imagery of the Black Panther Party. And late in life, he's become a significant internationally acknowledged and recognised artist, and has done a lot of work, collaborative work with another of my really close friends from Brisbane, Richard Bell, who I consider to be one of the truly great Australian contemporary artists. And it was through Richard Bell that I managed to also meet up with Emery Douglas in 2009 at the Sydney Festival. And again, this is the second greatest moment of my life, actually meeting Emery Douglas and being able to put my arm around a man who's still alive. I think there's only Bobby Seale and a few others of the original Black Panther Party still alive after all of the shootouts that happened over there. But it was the Black Panther Party in America that inspired a lot of the stuff that we were doing in Redfern in the early days. Like I said, free shopfront legal aid centres, free health clinics, free breakfast for kids programs, all that sort of stuff was largely us adapting and adopting ideas from these guys. How are we going for time?
We're doing all right.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So...
I thought you went away, Larry. I thought you got sick of me, mate.
Right, so you're going to show some images of you graduating at university and becoming a doctor. From these images, and we've got a couple here, and looking at these images of you graduating and your awards, how do you feel about your achievements and looking back after those years of resistance and struggle?
Well, I want to talk about going to the University of Melbourne. You will recall that I said a while ago that I got expelled from high school, terminated my secondary education, and I said that it really demolished my belief in education for 30 years, you know, which I'm really angry about now, looking back. And it wasn't until when I was almost 50, that a certain academic historian at the University of Melbourne, who tonight shall remain nameless, insulted me by suggesting that somehow or other I was a lesser person because I did not have that little bit of paper that said that I was a historian, academic historian. And I could have reacted in the way I did when I was young and punched him in the mouth. However, I took it as a challenge, and I thought, well, fuck you. I'll come and get your little Mickey Mouse bit of paper. You know, it mustn't be too difficult, you've got one. And so I went to the University of Melbourne, and some of my mates said to me, oh, Foley, you're only going to the University of Melbourne because it's a flash uni, aren't you? You want to go to the flash place. I said, no. I'm going to the University of Melbourne because it's the closest place I can ride my bike, push bike from Northcote into, you know, simple as that. I said, if Monash was close, I'd go there. So I go to the University of Melbourne, and the first thing that happened, going to the University of Melbourne, the people in the history department freaked out because the one thing that people in the Melbourne Uni History Department were really scared of, given that they were teaching Indigenous history, was an authentic Indigenous, not just an authentic Aboriginal, but an Aboriginal about whom they had been teaching stuff, that had featured in their lectures. And so, at first the history department people, because I got eyes and ears everywhere. And I found out fairly soon in the piece that they were saying, Foley's only here to make trouble, he won't last 6 months. This come back to me and I said, okay. And so I put my head down and my ass up and I got stuck into it. And I very quickly became the star student of my first year class, which wasn't difficult, I might add. And then as I started going well, and then the next thing I know, the history department starts saying, Foley's only doing well because he's got a specialist area of interest. I said, okay, so I signed up to a German history class. And I not only, I wrote an essay for my German history class that actually changed the course of history in this town when I wrote an essay called Couriers on the Holocaust. And you can go to the Holocaust Museum in Elsternwick today and see on the wall a plaque that is there because of that essay that I wrote when I was doing that. I also ended up tutoring in German history at Melbourne Uni. And anyway, to cut a long story short, because we only got 10 minutes to go, when I graduated with first class honours in a double major, history and cultural studies, the Vice-Chancellor, the then Vice-Chancellor, sent his personal emissary to be there, and that's him there. Roger Peacock come to get his photo taken with me when I graduated. That's when I got me undergrad. But then I kicked on and I got me PhD a few years later. It took a bit of a while. I'm a slow worker sometimes. And when I got my PhD, Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor, insists on turning up to get his photo taken with me. Not only Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor, but the then Governor-General, folks. GF on the GG. So, I felt pretty honoured by all of that, And to top it all off, not long after I got awarded the Chancellor's Award for Excellence for my PhD. And when I got the letter telling me that I'd got that, I thought, wow, a cheque, I was thinking, in Nobel Prize, $75,000 or something. But what did I get? I got a medal, and it wasn't even gold, it was brass. I mean to say. So I was pretty disappointed in that. But there you go, folks. Here's some of the awards they tell me I got. Anyhow, we won't go into that. I don't want to piss in my own pocket too much.
So this pushback photo... No, this pushback photo, Dr. Foley felt it was important to have this as one of his last images, and he's going to tell us why.
The reason this is here is because that thing there, well, it wasn't this specific thing. That specific thing there is something that my close friends bought me for my birthday a few years ago. One of them sitting in the front row here. But the reason I wanted you see me with my means of transport, my sole means of transport, is because about when I turned 40, in a rare flash of intelligent thought in my mind, I realised that if I didn't change my lifestyle, I was going to be dead before I was 50. And so I started riding a push bike when I turned 40. And then that paid off when 20 years later, I had a heart attack. And the only reason I'm still here, sitting here with you today, is because I'd been riding a push bike. And also because that heart attack, I gave up smoking in intensive care at St Vincent's Hospital. So any smokers among you here tonight, I can recommend when you have your heart attack, I can recommend when they're putting you in the ambulance, you tell those ambulance drivers, I want to go to St Vincent's Hospital. And when you get to St Vincent's Hospital, they wheel you out, you say, I want Andre Legrand. the cardiologist. I want Andre Legrand to operate on me. He's the guy who saved my life. That's the thing that saved my life, and that's the reason I'm still as handsome and as pretty today as what I am. That push bike, folks. So there's a lesson for all you old people. Larry, did you hear me, mate? Ride a push bike. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Lovely. And just we've got one more slide. I think there's...
And so, folks, that's it. For further information, visit either of these two websites that I created. The Koori History website, Kooriweb, is the oldest Aboriginal conceived, designed, created, run, controlled website in the world. I taught myself computer programming before I started going to uni a long time ago and created that then. And when I studied at the University of Melbourne, I did 3 subjects each semester. I did 1 subject in history, 1 subject in cultural studies, and I did 1 subject in computer science, just to prove to myself in my old age I was up to it. And that's why I'm intolerant of old people. When I say old people, I mean people my age. These days they say, oh, that technical stuff's too difficult for me. I said, don't talk shit to me, mate. You can do it. You can do it. And the Kooriweb website is the newer version of the Koori website. This is me upgrading my computer skills and creating stuff that you can actually look at on a mobile phone, which is no mean feat. So you want further information, go to that, or the last slide, read this book by Claire Land. This is, Claire and I studied history at Melbourne Uni together, and this is the definitive, until I publish mine, this is the definitive book for you to read if you want to know everything there is to know about being supportive of Aboriginal people in Australia, folks. Thank you, that's the end. And anyone who wants to talk to me, ask me questions, buy me a drink downstairs. Thank you.